The lion reunites with his dying benefactor, and what happens next will surprise you. The old man's labored breathing echoed in the small wooden cabin, while his glassy eyes contemplated the cracked ceiling. Manuel Rodriguez, 78 years old, knew his days were numbered. Cancer had won the battle, and now he could only wait for the end in that humble dwelling in the middle of the African savannah, where he had dedicated the last 40 years of his life to wildlife conservation. His trembling hands caressed the yellowed photograph resting on his chest. In it appeared a lion cub, barely a few weeks old, with golden eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul. It was Simba, as he had baptized him with a certain irony, remembering the Disney movie that his late wife had loved so much. The sound of heavy footsteps on the dry earth pulled him from his memories. Manuel frowned, puzzled. The nearest village was 3 hours' walk away, and he hadn't received visitors in weeks. His heart, weakened by illness, began to beat forcefully when he heard a deep, guttural roar that made the wooden walls vibrate. With great effort, he managed to sit up in his makeshift bed and direct his gaze toward the half-open door. What he saw left him breathless. A majestic lion with a golden and abundant mane stood in the doorway. His muscles tensed under his shining coat, and his eyes, those familiar golden eyes, observed the old man intently. "It can't be," Manuel murmured, feeling tears begin to well up in his tired eyes. "Simba, is it really you?" The lion took a cautious step toward the interior of the cabin, sniffing the air. His nostrils dilated as he processed the familiar scent, now mixed with the acrid smell of illness and medicine. A deep whimper escaped from his throat, a sound that Manuel recognized immediately. It was the same lament he emitted when he was a cub and felt scared or confused. Memories rushed into the old man's mind like an unstoppable cascade. He had found Simba 15 years ago, when he was nothing more than a golden ball of fur, abandoned next to his mother's lifeless body, victim of poachers. The little one was malnourished, dehydrated, and on the brink of death. Manuel had taken him to his cabin, where he spent entire nights feeding him with a bottle, healing his wounds, and comforting him during nightmares. For 2 years, Simba had been his inseparable companion. He grew strong and healthy under the conservationist's care, who had taught him everything necessary to survive in the wild. But Manuel knew that sooner or later he would have to let him go. Lions weren't made to live in captivity, no matter how much love was involved. The day of farewell had been the most difficult of his life. Simba, already converted into a young lion of imposing presence, had followed Manuel to the edge of his territory. There, the old man had spoken to him for the last time, explaining that he must leave, that his place was in the savannah with his own kind. The lion had looked at him with those intelligent eyes, as if understanding every word, before turning around and disappearing into the vegetation. Since then, Manuel had received sporadic news of him through other conservationists and forest rangers. Simba had become the leader of a prosperous pride, respected and feared equally. He had had several litters of cubs and had established himself as one of the most magnificent lions in the entire region. "You've grown so much," Manuel whispered, extending his trembling hand toward the animal. "You've become everything I hoped you would be." Simba approached slowly, with calculated and elegant movements. His wet nose touched the old man's extended palm, and a deep purr began to vibrate in his chest. It was the same sound he emitted when he was a cub and curled up next to Manuel during cold nights. The lion lay down next to the bed, resting his enormous head on the man's legs. Manuel felt the warmth of his body, the vital force that emanated from every fiber of his being. With fingers that no longer fully obeyed his will, he began to caress the silky mane, just as he had done thousands of times when Simba was small. "How did you know I needed you?" he asked in a low voice, although he knew he wouldn't get an answer. "How did you know I'm dying?" Animals have a sixth sense for these things, he thought. He had witnessed it during his decades working in conservation. Elephants that returned to visit the places where their loved ones had died, dogs that refused to abandon their masters, graves, mothers who cared for their sick cubs until the end. Hours passed in silence. Manuel dozed intermittently, always with Simba's comforting presence at his side. The lion didn't move once, maintaining himself as a silent guardian. Occasionally, the old man would wake up and find those golden eyes watching him with an intensity that transcended verbal communication. At dawn of the second day, Manuel woke with a mental clarity he hadn't experienced in weeks. The pain had diminished, as if Simba's presence had some healing power. He sat up more easily than in previous days and contemplated the lion's noble face. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice firmer than it had been in a long time. "Now, something I never told you when you were little." Simba raised his head, as if really paying attention to his words. "Your mother didn't die because of poachers," Manuel began, feeling a knot form in his throat. I killed her." The words fell like stones in the cabin's silence. Manuel closed his eyes, preparing for the lion's reaction, but Simba remained motionless, waiting. "It was my first year here," the old man continued, tears rolling down his wrinkled cheeks. "I worked for an organization that supposedly protected wildlife, but we were actually disguised hunters. They paid us for every animal we eliminated, especially predators that threatened the ranchers' livestock." The confession poured out of him like water from a broken dam. For decades he had carried that guilt, the weight of having been everything opposite to what he subsequently became. I saw your mother with her litter," he continued, his voice broken by emotion. "She was beautiful, majestic, the most magnificent lioness I had ever seen. But I had orders. I raised the rifle and shot. She fell instantly, but when I approached, I discovered she had been protecting her cubs. Your siblings were already dead, probably from hunger, but you were still breathing." Manuel opened his eyes and looked directly at Simba. The lion observed him with that inscrutable expression typical of felines, but there was no aggressiveness in his posture. "At that moment, something changed in me," he continued. "I took you in my arms, so small and fragile, and I knew I couldn't continue with that life. I quit that same week and dedicated the rest of my existence to trying to compensate for the damage I had caused. But nothing I did afterward could erase the fact that I killed your mother." Silence stretched between them like an open wound. Manuel expected Simba to get up and leave, for his instinct to tell him that the man who had been caring for him during these days was, in reality, his enemy. But the lion didn't move. Instead, Simba moved closer until his face was just inches from Manuel's. His golden eyes met the old man's, and in them Manuel saw no hate or resentment. He saw understanding, forgiveness, and something that could only be described as unconditional love. A soft roar escaped from the lion's throat, different from all those Manuel had heard before. It wasn't of threat or dominance, but something much deeper and more emotional. It was the sound of a son comforting his father. "Do you forgive me?" Manuel whispered, caressing the animal's face. "Can you forgive the man who took away the most important thing in the world from you?" As an answer, Simba pressed his forehead against the old man's, in a gesture that was purely human in its tenderness. Manuel felt how all the guilt and pain he had carried for decades began to fade away. The lion's forgiveness was more powerful than any religious absolution or psychological therapy. During the following days, Manuel experienced an extraordinary transformation. Although his body continued to weaken, his spirit grew stronger. Simba never strayed from his side, hunting near the cabin to feed and always returning before nightfall. It was as if he had postponed his responsibilities as pride leader to be with the man who had raised him. One morning, Manuel woke up and found that breathing had become more difficult. He knew the end was near. With great effort, he managed to leave the cabin and sit under the great baobab he had planted years ago. Simba followed him and settled beside him, his massive body providing warmth and comfort. "Thank you," Manuel murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for teaching me what true forgiveness means. Thank you for showing me that love can transcend even the most terrible mistakes." Simba raised his head and emitted a long, melancholic roar that resonated throughout the savannah. It was a call, a goodbye, a funeral song that seemed to echo in every corner of the territory. Other lions responded from the distance, as if the entire community was bidding farewell to the old conservationist. Manuel closed his eyes for the last time, feeling the lion's comforting presence at his side. His last thought was of deep gratitude toward the animal that had taught him life's most important lesson, that true love knows no boundaries, that forgiveness can heal the deepest wounds, and that redemption is always possible, no matter how dark the past may have been. Simba remained beside Manuel's lifeless body for 3 complete days, as lions do when they lose an important member of their pride. He only moved away to drink water, always returning to his guardian position. On the 4th day, when forest rangers finally arrived at the cabin after hearing the roars and receiving no response to their radio calls, they found Manuel under the baobab with an expression of absolute peace on his face. A few meters away, Simba stood guard, but respectfully moved away when the humans approached. One of the rangers, a young man named Joseph who had known both Manuel and Simba for years, approached the lion with tears in his eyes. "Thank you for taking care of him until the end," he told him. "You knew how much he loved you, didn't you?" Simba looked at him one last time, as if perfectly understanding the words. Then he turned around and began walking toward the savannah, stopping only once to roar softly in the direction of the cabin. It was his final farewell, his promise that he would never forget the man who had saved him, raised him, and finally taught him the true meaning of forgiveness. The rangers found a diary in the cabin where Manuel had meticulously documented his personal transformation, from ruthless hunter to dedicated conservationist. In the last pages, written with trembling handwriting during his final days, there was a complete confession of his past and a deep reflection on how a lion's love had shown him the path to redemption. "If you are reading this," he had written, "it means I have departed, but don't feel sorry for me. I have lived long enough to learn that past mistakes don't define who we are, but how we choose to live after making them. Simba taught me that forgiveness is not only possible, but necessary for healing. If there's something I want you to remember from my story, it's this: it's never too late to change, never too late for love, and never too late for redemption." Years later, the story of Manuel and Simba became legend in the region. Forest rangers told it to visitors, village elders narrated it to their grandchildren, and conservationists worldwide cited it as an example of the transformative power of love between species. Simba lived many more years, becoming the most respected lion in the entire reserve. He had numerous descendants, and locals swore they all carried a special spark in their golden eyes, as if they had inherited something of the wisdom and compassion their patriarch had learned from an old Spanish man named Manuel. The cabin was converted into a small museum, and the baobab, under which Manuel had spent his last moments, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking inspiration and hope. A bronze plaque placed on the tree's trunk bore the engraved final words from Manuel's diary: "True love transcends species, time, and even death itself." This story reminds us that everyone deserves a second chance, that forgiveness has the power to heal the deepest wounds, and that the strongest bonds are often forged in the most unexpected moments. If this story has moved you as much as it has moved me in telling it, don't forget to give it a like and share it. because stories like this need to be told again and again, reminding us that redemption is always possible and that true love can be found in the most surprising places.